Hello, everybody. Welcome to class. Today we will be talking about causation and how you build that into a research design. Now, you may have remembered from your statistics class that correlation does not mean or equal causation, but there are ways in which we can model and sequence our research so that we can have a better idea of some actual causation. And to find out, all right, which came first, the chicken or the egg? And does our intervention actually work? So that is what we're going to be exploring today. So when we talk about causation, we need to really be thinking about how do we structure our design. You need to have a good theory of, how is this going to be playing out. Um, or, I suppose, there is a little bit of qualitativeness that you can do, but generally it is more of a qualitative thing to be able to indicate causation. But in essence, how we use the analysis, how we understand errors and the influence of outside forces. So that's really, perhaps what we mean most in terms of errors here. Stuff that is beyond your control out in society or things about an individual. Uh, and then, we will talk about cross-sectional designs versus longitudinal designs. And then we'll get into some of the causal explanations. Okay, so to begin here, one aspect of understanding causal analysis is that we need to focus on understanding who is being observed, who is our research subject, who is our survey respondent, who is the person who is participating. So, kind of varying levels of social justice terminology here and wokeness. Sorry, I said that. Then we have so it starts out with, what's the level of analysis here? So the level of social life in which we're focused. So is the level an individual? Is it a family unit? Is it a community unit? Is it a group? What is it? Uh, and that's kind of what it is that we're trying to understand, kind of what about this different aspect of social life? Are we looking at the micro, meso, or macro level? The unit of observation is the people of, that we are collecting data about, or who are, contributing their data to the process. So this is that level of social life at which the data is collected. Those are not necessarily the same. So that's really important to keep in mind because as we start extrapolating understandings, then we might be able to be taking it a little bit too far, and making assumptions about our unit of analysis when we really need to be staying within the realm of our unit of observation. One case in point, when I did my research in Bolivia, I interviewed 15 people. And of those 15 people, one told me that their business and their life were better off for having used microcredit. Microcredit being, taking out these small loans of maybe $100 or a couple $100 and investing them then in their business. And of the remaining 14, seven told me that, nah, no better nor worse for my life or my business for having used the credit. So, all right, whatever. But then the other seven, so this is almost half, told me, yeah, actually, my business and or my life are actually worse off for having used the credit. Now, I could say, wow, okay, so almost half of people who take out these small dollar loans are actually worse off because now they're in debt. And I was starting to you know, make that assumption there. But what I was doing was taking seven people's experience at the unit or at the level of the observation, and I was applying it to the level of analysis. And I really did not have enough data to be able to say it, nor did I have enough sequencing to really be able to prove it, to say that, using that debt caused their worries and anxieties and caused their well-being to be worse. So I needed to really kind of hedge my language and simply say, this is what I observed. This is what people told me, period. And left it at that and said, I was like, hey, this is something that we're going to need to investigate more and is worth, following up on and, understanding that perhaps it is not all a panacea or a what would another word for panacea be? A cure for poverty, as it was being touted. Okay, so as we are going then about this, when we are, as we are engaging in some of these conclusions, um, they draw conclusions about individuals when, from group data. So perhaps you've read a study about a certain group, and then you're making assumptions then about individuals, such as um, all African Americans like soul food. Okay. Soul food being collard greens and um, fried chicken and coleslaw and potato salad and macaroni and cheese and these types of things. All right. Well, that may be a cultural thing, and some African Americans may like that. However, I know some African Americans who are thrilled to have Indian food from India. Um, and eating other forms of dishes and so or maybe they like to eat Caribbean food, who knows, but point being, next time you meet somebody, you might not want to make that assumption. um, One assumption that I made when I was in fourth grade and met my first Asian American, I asked him what he had for dinner. And I was thinking, hey, he probably had Chinese food. No, he told me he had hot dogs for dinner. And he just thought, it's like, what a weird question. Okay. So I had made an ecological fallacy. And so, I mean, this is actually, when we make a conclusion about an individual, we do this with, when we engage in racist thinking every day. So we need to be then, kind of checking our bias and it's like, hey, you know what? Every individual is an individual. And so not to make those assumptions about them based on what may actually be valid group data, based on cultural understanding, but we need to ask then the individual, what is your experience? What are your likes and dislikes and so forth? Now, when we engage in reductionism, this is when, the researcher maybe draws conclusions about the groups from data about individuals. And this is what I did in Bolivia. I had data from individuals, but I was now, starting to make assumptions about the whole groups that all or many of the folks who engage in microcredit, taking out these loans, that it's bad, and it's bad for them. So this can create, false conclusions to be drawn. So when we want to minimize some of this error or misinterpretation when we engage in this causal reasoning. So when possible, we want to avoid errors by analyzing the data and drawing conclusions about um, so basically, we want to keep our understanding at the same level. We don't want it to go up a level or down a level. So we don't want to draw conclusions up or down, keep them within groups. So if we've got data about group, then we make the conclusion about a group. If we have data about an individual, then we keep it at that level of the individual. We don't extrapolate one to, up a level or down a level. Does that make sense? Um, and we also need to then keep in mind, alrighty, to what degree are people making causal implications in their own uh, studies? And have they approached their causal analysis in the correct way, that they are actually now justified in being able to make such a conclusion, or should they really be hedging um, their their language? So, so as we're reading and consuming other people's research, we need to kind of be mindful of this taking place. Now, there are many different types of research designs. If we are to boil it down to two types, within a quantitative approach, oftentimes, uh, we would have, say, the cross-sectional. So that would just kind of be at one moment in time, and we can gather a lot of data about that specific moment in time. Or we can actually get that data from 2 points in time, two or more points in time. So this would be a longitudinal. So think long period of time, longitudinal. Cross-sectional would be if you've got, say, an orange and you slice it, and you can then see the cross section, and so see everything that's kind of there, but we can't see it over time. We can only see it as it is at that moment. Uh, All right. So when we would use, say, a cross-sectional design is when we have an independent variable that's fixed. So in relation then to a dependent variable. So for instance, uh, demographics, for the most part, are considered fixed. A person, and typically we would say gender, racial identity, um, various other social constructs, which, I mean, very quickly we see is like, hey, how fixed are these? And to what degree are they fluid? To what degree are they, because they're socially constructed, um, it's how does the interpretation, can that change? Social and economic status. But for the most part, these do not change, kind of every year. They are fairly static. Um, so those would be, some of these fixed independent variables, and it's established before there's any dependent variable that we're measuring, such as a person's financial well-being. Um, then we have, perhaps when respondents can be trusted, maybe they've been recording or journaling for a period of time before something happens that we are then studying. So before maybe they're journaling and then they have a panic attack, and we want to understand, what led up to that panic attack. And so we might be able to look and see, we can trust their account based on what they've written, because they're not subject to recall bias. We can actually see, okay, this is what that person was feeling today. Then we have measures that are based on records, such as administrative data. And so, again, these are kind of collected for the most part in real time. And so we can have a greater degree of authenticity and reliability, that this is actually good data. And then we can kind of measure changes then over time based on these records. Then another one would be when you've got cases that are equivalent on the dependent variable before the independent variable was introduced. So, for instance, if you've got new immigrants, everybody does not speak English, or none of them speak English, and so you want to kind of take a look at, all right, what's the impact of a language program? And so our language program is the independent variable that then later impacts their English capabilities. So the thing is, we have a baseline, for instance, where everybody's starting out on the same level of not being able to speak English. Uh, and then, but that's the impact, or our dependent variable, is then their language capability after the fact, after they have now um, utilized the language program, which is the independent variable. That's the one piece that does not change. The other is our longitudinal design. And so there's a couple different ways in which we can go through those. One is through trends, where, for instance, unemployment and understanding unemployment. So unemployment will continue to exist, but not everybody will, and all the same people will always be unemployed. People will kind of come into unemployment and then they will drop out of unemployment, and other people will come in and replace them. So people will come and go. So we'll collect data. Or statisticians will, researchers will collect the data multiple times over, the course of a year. But at the same time, it's different samples of people. So we need to understand then, is this population changing over time? How are they changing? The other, or another, is a panel design. And so this tracks the same people through, over time, usually asking the same, or sometimes they'll introduce different questions, because those are now of interest. But generally, they want to ask questions. And one panel design that I'm familiar with is the SHED survey, the Survey on Household and Economic Decision Making. Um, and so we want to then determine if individuals are changing over time. How is their income changing? How is their financial well-being changing? How are the decisions that they make changing in relation to, the economic conditions around them? So we need to be tracking the very same individuals. We can't be tracking different individuals every time. And then you've got cohort studies. And so this would be, a group that has a particular characteristic. Everybody has, a feature that distinguishes them to each other, such as they're all roughly the same age. Maybe they're all millennials, or they're all Gen X, or maybe they uh, all use a certain form of social media, or maybe they all have a drug or substance use disorder, these types of things. So these are a bit more event-based, and so they follow the sample at one or more times. Um, and so they will, kind of have this group, and so then be able to look at comparisons between groups who are all fit that criteria. So it kind of merges the accuracy of a panel design without some of the same risk of attrition, or people like, oh, I have to answer another questionnaire. So you're not burdening the group. So as long as you know, okay, what are the characteristics of people who would be in this cohort, then you allow, some flexibility in terms of different people being in there, but not burdening them with, having to answer too many research questions. So we've talked a little bit about the cross-sectional and longitudinal design, and so this kind of gets us then to this place of being then able to make a causal explanation. And so, we need to define cause. So this is where, we've got some sort of characteristic or attitude, or, quality of a particular individual or entity or groups. Um, and so it's something that explains why it is. So being able to verify that, yes, this explains in a cause and effect relationship here. So being able to do that, though, is very tricky. Now, we can do it with both through qualitative, where we call those ideographic explanations. And so through that, through your qualitative research, you identify a very specific sequence of events or thoughts or actions that then result in a particular outcome for that person. So maybe you're working with an individual, you're following them over a period of time. Maybe the person gets into a car accident, And so then they start taking opioids for pain to manage the pain. And then they develop a substance use addiction to those pain medications. So the causal explanation, as you are, working with this individual, and kind of tracing their life, is that this addiction maybe was caused by the original accident that they had. Who knows? Um, the quantitative or the nomothetic causal explanation is where you've got the variation of an independent variable is going to be followed by a variation in the dependent variable, holding everything else constant. So if you, um, you know, add more independent variables or at a higher level of your independent variables, such as um, if you increase the stress that a person is experiencing and you measure that stress, um, and that is, that goes up, then the likelihood of a person developing a poor coping mechanism, such as an addiction, also goes up. Okay. So how you measure that and the sequencing in which you measure that. Or it might be, with greater meditation, the person has lower incidence of um, using substances for coping. I don't know, where they start running more miles and they have less urges um, to use substances. If they're part of a running group that is focused on um, both training for a marathon and um, reducing their substance use dependency. So so it's that belief, and so that's where especially we need to have a theory that guides that, and then we can look at the relationships between those. Now, there has to be then certain criteria, especially for when we do this in a quantitative way or the nomothetic way. And so we have to have an empirical association, so meaning that there has to be some research, there has to be a distinct sequencing, in terms of time. Um, and then there has to be some non-spuriousness. So there can't be some other factor coming into the relationship. And so we'll talk more about that. And it really helps if you can identify what precisely is the causal mechanism and in the context in which this happens. So those are kind of the five criteria. So the empirical association is this is when we've got some research, we've got data that we've collected where we can identify, okay, we have an independent variable, this changed, and as a result, we see a change in the dependent variable that corresponds. And when we have that time order, we can see that change happened after we instituted the change in the independent variable. So, for instance, if training for a marathon helps people heal from their substance use addictions, then we can't be observing people getting better before they start training or without the training, and then they go run a marathon. So there has to be you train, you run the marathon, then, through that process, we then observe, one happened before, and then, they felt like, okay, I have less use of or need to use alcohol or drugs. Then you've got that non-spuriousness. And so when we talked about a spurious relationship, this is where you've got two variables when, and you're claiming a relationship, but the impact is actually caused by a third component. So just running and training for a marathon, that may not actually be the what is causing a person to have lower desire to use substances. Maybe it is the social relationships and the encouragement that they are getting from peers in the running group. In which case, then it may not actually be, a marathon that it has to, that they have to be training for. They could be part of a knitting group. I don't know. Or they could be, doing some other type of activity in which there's actually social support and a peer group, and that could be causing the impact. So uh, we need to kind of tease out is there anything that is impacting that? And so when we have randomization, um, this helps to reduce the risk of this. Uh, but at the same time, we also want to, try and utilize statistical controls. And so this is where we say, we'll control for racism or race. We'll control for gender. We'll control for socioeconomic status. We'll control for their participation in other forms of groups. So maybe we'll have people who, participate in groups, but then people who did not participate in groups and people who simply ran alone and trained alone for a marathon. So, so that way we can then isolate that, and there's ways you can do that statistically, um, because hey, there's already been shown that um, people of a certain socioeconomic status might be more inclined to use substances or certain substances. Some people who are wealthier use different types of substances. So you want to be able to kind of isolate that and take that out of the equation. So that way we can then, kind of keep it then focused on those two variables when we might be, knowing, hey, there's 4 or 5 or 6 other variables that could be impacting here as part of the environment. So we need to kind of take those out of the equation, so to speak. And then we said, it's really, really helpful if there's a causal mechanism and that we understand the broader context. So with this causal mechanism, there's, there's a process that makes the connection happen. So with my dissertation, I was looking at, a person's level of financial precarity, how much money that they had for emergencies and how they felt about it. Was it making them anxious? These types of things. And then the impact, perhaps, on their financial well-being. But one of the pieces here that's a process that then determines how it impacts their financial well-being is then their financial efficacy. And this is what they can do about their situation, their ability to problem solve, their ability to actually budget and to pay their bills and to engage in some of these executive functioning activities. So this can then have, they can have poor financial precarity, but if they have good coping skills, then it's going to improve their financial well-being. If they have poor coping skills, then we've got, that financial precarity is going to result in poor financial well-being. So this is the process piece, what is actually happening. And so that would be, maybe your verb in the equation that makes that connection between the two variables, the independent and the dependent variable, and whether the dependent variable goes up or down, has a positive or negative relationship in relation to how the independent one, uh, went up or down. And then, there's the context, and this is where, particularly for those of us as social workers, we understand person in environment, and this is where the environment comes to play. And so all of these relationships that we have exist in broader context with other variables. So to the extent that we can collect, some of these other variables becomes really important. And so this is really, kind of the balance of, hey, we would love to be able to collect gazillion different variables to understand what's going on and to best approximate it. But One, we don't have the money or the resources to be able to do it. And two, the people, themselves would be filling out surveys all day long to answer all of those questions. So you need to highlight what are certainly the most crucial and important ones of that context, so that way you can then control for them. And to really then situate your findings in that particular type of context. For instance, in Bolivia, one of the contexts that was really important was that none of these people who were taking out these microloans were part of a group. And so, whereas group lending was a really big feature of how microcredit was handled in other countries, especially in Bangladesh, where this particular type of model of lending by banks was was started. And so, but it was here in Bolivia, it was simply, the context was that people were taking out these loans as individuals, and that then had an impact on the cost of the loan and how much interest they had then had to pay back. So we needed to understand and situate my findings in that context, that perhaps they were actually paying higher interest than, say, people in Bangladesh. So as a result, the findings, were such that maybe it wasn't being as implemented in such a good way. All right. So when we compare then research designs, whether we're using cross-sectional or longitudinal or these types, we have to really again consider it in that broader context. And so we need to understand what is our research problem, what are the opportunities to understand it and to do that research. What has some of the prior research said? What types of commitments are we committed to, such as, kind of a social justice lens? Who is participating in this research? Who is interpreting this research? What are the goals of this? So as we consider all of these factors, we that then is needed to then understand and evaluate certain types of designs, and which would be more appropriate and which would be less appropriate, how we go about them. So that becomes then a part of the evaluation and deciding, okay, I'm going to try and do my best, and then I'm going to pick a particular type of research design based on all of these influences. So in the end, evidence-based practice, when we apply this research for our casework as social workers, we need to understand, how was the research done? Who was studied? How were they studied? And then if you understand that, then you can then better translate or not to translate certain findings. Or maybe something in the middle, maybe how you take those findings and what you do with them, and who of your clients you can reasonably, say, okay, these findings might help my African American clients, but might not be so good for my Asian American clients or my white clients. So understanding that certain trends and certain ways of family structure might be more applicable to one group versus another. So, what ultimately would be is then that you want to be able to compare them to their former selves rather than to other people. And so, how is this individual improving at the end of the day? Measuring them against their own baseline rather than measuring them in comparison to another person. So, different structures, different limitations on the type of research will then impact how it is that we translate those findings then to improve our own practice. Okay, the end. A little bit shorter lecture. Thank you for joining, and I will see you in the next video. Thanks so much.